Theodore Roosevelt National Park covers thousands of acres of empty prairie, where a single ranger can spend an entire day without seeing another person. For Ranger David, that isolation was part of the job, until one routine radio check was answered by a station that officially no longer existed. At first it sounded like a simple radio error, but within days, someone was already watching the station from the darkness. I had already spent 26 years with the National Park Service when I agreed to fill a 3-week staffing gap at a seasonal fire lookout support station in the North Unit of Theodore Roosevelt National Park. I was 58 then, close enough to retirement that younger rangers joked I could identify every prairie sound by memory. They weren't entirely wrong. Most mornings began the same way. I unlocked the maintenance shed, checked the weather instruments, logged overnight temperatures, tested the VHF radio at 6:30, and drove a battered utility truck between the support station and the isolated lookout tower, perched on a long ridge above the Little Missouri River. Tourists rarely saw that side of the park. Once the scenic drives emptied out in late autumn, there were days when I might encounter one photographer, a survey crew, and nobody else until sunset. That quiet was exactly why the first incident stood out. During a routine radio check on my second morning, another station answered using our district frequency, but identified itself with a call sign that hadn't existed for nearly a decade. The transmission lasted only a few seconds before dissolving into static. I assumed someone had read from an outdated emergency frequency chart, logged it as an equipment anomaly, and continued with the day. By mid-afternoon, a cold front rolled across the Badlands, flattening the grass with steady wind and carrying a haze of dust through the draws. I spent the rest of the afternoon replacing weather-damaged trail closure notices at a remote backcountry access point. The permit box there contained exactly 3 forms, all dated correctly, but the pencil attached by its chain had been sharpened with a knife instead of the small hand sharpener mounted inside the box. It was a tiny detail. Visitors usually snapped the lead or misplaced the pencil altogether. This one had been carved carefully, almost professionally. I replaced it without thinking much about it until I noticed something else. The last permit holder had written the campsite number in perfect block letters, but left every other field blank, including vehicle information, emergency contact, and destination route. Nobody checking in legitimately filled out a permit that way. I photographed the form, sealed the box, and drove back before the weather worsened. That evening, dispatch mentioned a rancher outside the park boundary had reported headlights crossing restricted prairie after midnight for 2 nights in a row. Officers found nothing. The area was too open to hide vehicles easily, so everyone assumed the lights had come from oil field traffic farther east. The following morning, the lookout tower called me instead of the other way around. The volunteer observer sounded uneasy without sounding frightened. He said someone had been standing near the base of the tower before sunrise, not climbing it, not damaging anything, just looking up for several minutes before walking into a drainage where visibility disappeared. He couldn't describe much beyond a dark jacket and a tan cap. We searched the area together. The ground was firm enough to preserve only partial boot impressions, but I did notice tire tracks leading to an old maintenance road that had been permanently closed after erosion several years earlier. The track stopped at a locked steel gate. Beyond it, fresh footprints continued on foot. Whoever had been there understood exactly where vehicles would attract attention and where they wouldn't. We notified law enforcement, updated the patrol schedule, and added extra radio checks every 90 minutes because cellular service in that part of the park was unreliable. By late afternoon, another curious detail surfaced. The outdated radio call sign from the previous day appeared again, this time requesting a weather update using the correct procedures, but ending the transmission before answering any verification questions. The voice sounded calm, middle-aged, and familiar in a way I couldn't place. Not theatrical, just practiced. Our communications technician checked the repeater logs and confirmed the signal hadn't originated from any registered park radio. That narrowed nothing. Anyone with compatible equipment could reach the frequency from the surrounding high ground. The next day, I drove supplies to a backcountry trail maintenance cache tucked inside a shallow canyon. Inventory was mostly unchanged except for one item. Somebody had removed 2 reflective traffic vests while ignoring fuel, tools, batteries, and expensive GPS equipment. That choice made no sense if theft was the goal. Reflective vests, on the other hand, made it easier to appear official from a distance. I reported the missing equipment immediately. Law enforcement expanded patrols near boundary roads, but staffing was thin because another district was dealing with flood damage. That evening, a heavy bank of fog settled into the river valley, much earlier than forecast. Visibility shrank until the lookout tower disappeared from the support station, even though it stood less than 2 miles away. During the 6:30 radio check, the volunteer reported seeing brief flashlight signals from the closed maintenance road below the ridge, not random movement. 3 short flashes, a pause, 2 more. He assumed it was another ranger, until nobody answered his acknowledgement. I drove toward the road while another unit approached from the opposite direction. We reached the locked gate within minutes of each other and found no vehicles, but the chain securing the gate had been threaded incorrectly after someone unlocked and relocked it. Most people never notice details like that. Rangers do, because we secure hundreds of gates every year and tend to repeat the same motions without thinking. Whoever passed through had access to a key or a convincing duplicate. The key registry showed every issued key still accounted for. We changed the lock anyway. Overnight temperatures dropped below freezing. Frost settled over the prairie, outlining every tire impression left the previous evening. At first light, we followed the freshest tracks across open grassland until they disappeared onto a gravel county road outside federal jurisdiction. The sheriff's office picked up the trail there and eventually located an abandoned utility trailer behind an unused livestock loading site. Inside were spare fuel containers, reflective vests matching the missing pair from our cache, handheld radios programmed with public safety frequencies, outdated park maps marked with seasonal patrol notes, and several laminated identification cards made to resemble government credentials without copying any specific agency exactly. It became increasingly clear someone had been rehearsing authority rather than exercising it. Investigators believed the equipment was connected to a group moving stolen industrial materials between remote job sites by presenting themselves as maintenance personnel whenever they encountered questions on isolated roads. The case stretched across state lines and quietly disappeared into larger investigations beyond our park. Officially, the incident ended there. The radios fell silent. The false permits stopped appearing. The lookout volunteer finished his assignment without another sighting. I returned to my home district, believing the strangest part had simply been working somewhere isolated enough that small irregularities became obvious. Merely a year later, I received a phone call from the communications technician who had archived the radio recordings. While updating older files, he discovered that the first mysterious transmission, the one using the obsolete call sign, had been recorded more clearly on a backup receiver than on a primary system. He slowed the audio to isolate background noise. Beneath the voice, almost hidden by static, was the steady clatter of a diesel generator. Not unusual by itself, what caught his attention was its rhythm. Every seasonal support station in that region used identical generators, except one. Ours had a worn cooling fan that produced a faint metallic click every few seconds until it was replaced the following winter. The transmission hadn't come from somewhere outside the park at all. It had been made from close enough to our own support station that the recorder captured the sound of our generator running behind the speaker, which meant whoever was using that obsolete call sign had been standing near our building long before any of us realized someone understood our routines. I wasn't a career ranger when this happened. I was 34, a former county paramedic who had taken a seasonal search and rescue position with the National Forest in Washington because I wanted work where emergencies were less frequent but demanded more planning. That assumption turned out to be optimistic. The incident unfolded over 4 days in late October after the first heavy rainstorms, and even now I think about it whenever I hear someone say that the wilderness is empty once tourist season ends. It isn't empty. It just belongs to fewer people, which makes unusual behavior stand out faster. The operation started with what looked like a routine overdue hiker report. A retired school teacher had signed out at a remote trail register near an old fire lookout access road and never returned to her vehicle. We organized the search from a small district contact station tucked between cedar-covered ridges, where radio reception depended on which slope you were standing on. I was assigned to one of 2 field teams, while another crew worked the neighboring drainage. We synchronized watches because our radio windows only overlapped every hour when both teams climbed high enough to reach the repeater. The first afternoon produced nothing except rain-soaked boot impressions that dissolved before anyone could photograph them properly. What did survive the weather was stranger. Halfway through an abandoned logging spur, we found bright orange survey ribbon, tied at shoulder height every 50 yards. It wasn't Forest Service ribbon. Ours carries printed identification. This was hardware store plastic with no markings at all. It led away from the official trail rather than toward it. We assumed an amateur hunter had marked a route, documented the location, removed a few strips, and continued the search. Around sunset, the other team radioed that they had discovered an abandoned pickup hidden beneath camouflage netting nearly 2 miles beyond a road closure. License plates had been removed. Dispatch began checking the vehicle identification number while we returned to the station through steady rain that turned every rut into ankle-deep mud. Overnight, the missing hiker's family confirmed she had never mentioned leaving marked trails. The next morning, the VIN came back connected to a theft report from another state almost 8 months earlier. That shifted priorities. Law enforcement joined the operation, but our search assignment remained unchanged because finding the missing woman still came first. We divided the drainage into tighter grids. Near noon, I noticed something that almost escaped me. Every piece of unauthorized ribbon we had removed the previous day had been replaced overnight. Same locations, same spacing, freshly tied. Nobody admitted doing it. Rain had softened the knots enough that whoever retied them couldn't have done it much earlier than dawn. We followed the line farther than before, expecting it to end at a hunting blind or illegal campsite. Instead, it curved back toward our own search corridor in a wide loop that crossed itself several times. Anyone relying on those markers could waste hours walking circles through dense timber without realizing it. We cut them all down again and packed them out. During our scheduled radio window, the second field, team reported hearing chainsaws in a protected watershed where no logging was authorized. By the time officers reached that area, the sound had stopped. They found fresh tire tracks but no equipment. The weather worsened that afternoon. Rain turned to wet snow above 4,000 feet, limiting helicopter support and forcing everyone to work on foot. Visibility narrowed until ridgelines disappeared behind low cloud. We sheltered briefly beneath a rock overhang to update maps, and that was where I made a mistake. I assumed a boot print beside the shelter belonged to one of our own crews because the tread resembled standard search boots. Later, comparing measurements, I realized it was almost 2 sizes larger than any boot issued to our personnel. Small oversight, important one. That evening we regrouped at the station. The administrative clerk mentioned that someone had signed the visitor log during lunch while everyone else was outside loading equipment. The signature was impossible to identify because the name had been scribbled over repeatedly until the paper nearly tore through. Nobody remembered seeing a visitor. Security cameras covered only the fuel pumps, not the front office. The third morning began with an unexpected break. The missing school teacher was located alive by the parallel ranger team, nearly 6 miles from where she had intended to hike. She was dehydrated, exhausted, and embarrassed more than injured. She insisted she had followed orange trail markers after losing sight of the official path because they looked deliberate and professionally placed. She genuinely believed they had been installed by the Forest Service. That explained how she became lost, but it raised a larger question. Why would someone repeatedly place false route markers during an active search operation? Once she was evacuated, Law enforcement shifted attention toward the unauthorized vehicle and suspicious activity. My assignment changed from rescue to assisting investigators with backcountry access. We revisited the hidden pickup. This time we searched beyond it and found a narrow footpath leading into thick second-growth forest where old skid roads had vanished decades earlier. About a mile in, we came across a cluster of makeshift storage pits covered with cedar branches. They weren't stocked with food or camping supplies. They contained replacement license plates, fuel cans, handheld radios without identifying labels, and laminated maps showing little-used service roads across 3 different forest districts. Whoever used the site clearly knew ranger patrol patterns, because several notes listed seasonal staffing schedules with surprising accuracy. Before we could examine everything, one deputy noticed fresh footprints leaving the area uphill. They were less than an hour old according to the tracker traveling with us. We followed cautiously until the trail disappeared onto exposed rock slick from melting snow. There was no confrontation, no dramatic chase, just the quiet realization that whoever had occupied the site had probably watched us arrive, gathered what mattered most, and slipped away before we reached the first cache. The investigation continued for months. Several arrests were eventually made in connection with organized thefts from remote construction sites across multiple counties. And officials considered the case resolved because the recovered evidence linked the suspects to stolen equipment and illegal vehicle movements through public land. Yet one detail never fit. Weeks after everything ended, I was helping archive search paperwork when I found the original field map from our first operational briefing. Before the search had even started, before anyone knew where the missing hiker might have wandered, someone had lightly marked a looping route in blue grease pencil that matched almost perfectly with the false ribbon trail we discovered later. None of us had drawn it. The map had been hanging on the operations wall from the first hour of the incident, which meant whoever created those misleading markers hadn't just known the forest. They had known where we intended to search before our teams ever left the station. I spent 12 seasons as a backcountry ranger in the Absaroka section of Yellowstone, and by the time this happened, I was in my early 50s, old enough to trust routine more than instinct, because routine usually keeps you alive. That September, I'd been assigned to reopen a remote ranger cabin after a week-long wind event that had dropped trees across several horse trails. The cabin sat nearly 18 miles from the nearest vehicle access, tucked beside a meadow where elk usually gathered before first snow. My responsibilities were ordinary enough: inspect the radio relay battery, update the permit log, replace damaged trail markers, check a small generator that only ran when needed, and report trail conditions during the evening communication window at 7. The ride-in took most of the day. Wind had stripped yellow leaves from the aspens until they lay across the trail in damp layers that muffled my horse's steps. By late afternoon, I reached the cabin, unlocked the heavy steel shutter over the radio antenna switch, and noticed something I couldn't explain. The permit board mounted outside had been wiped perfectly clean. We hadn't serviced that board in over a month. Normally it collected dust, pine pollen, and insect stains. Instead, it looked as though someone had carefully brushed every inch of it, while leaving the weathered wood frame untouched. I made a note because unusual maintenance is still unusual. After unloading supplies, I checked the cabin inventory. Lantern fuel matched the log. Medical kit was sealed, emergency cache untouched. The only discrepancy was a trail map missing from the wall rack. Not valuable enough to worry about immediately, since visitors sometimes borrowed one during emergencies and later mailed replacements. Around 6, I walked a quarter-mile to inspect a washed-out footbridge. Fresh boot impressions crossed the damp soil near the creek. They were deeper than backpacker prints because the heel carried more weight than the toe, something I usually associated with someone hauling equipment instead of camping gear. They weren't heading toward a designated campsite either. They angled through dense timber where there were no maintained routes. I measured one with my pocket ruler, photographed it for the maintenance report, then returned to the cabin as the temperature dropped faster than expected. At 7, I completed my radio check with district dispatch, Reception faded in and out because one of the relay sites farther south had lost solar power after the storm, but we exchanged enough information. I mentioned the missing map in the tracks. Dispatch logged both and reminded me that a trail crew would arrive sometime the following afternoon. Nothing sounded urgent. Darkness settled quickly. The generator hummed for 20 minutes while I charged the handheld radio batteries. Then I shut it down to conserve fuel. Out there, silence isn't complete. You hear wind pushing through lodgepole pines, the creek moving over stones, an occasional branch settling. That night, another sound carried across the meadow. An engine. Very faint. It rose for perhaps 15 seconds before fading. There were no legal vehicle routes anywhere close enough for me to hear one, unless someone had driven far beyond a locked service gate nearly 12 miles away. I stepped onto the porch with binoculars out of habit, even though there was nothing left to see. The air smelled faintly of wet sage after the afternoon drizzle. No lights, no movement. Just the engine that had already gone quiet. I slipped lightly. Before dawn, I checked weather instruments mounted behind the cabin. Pressure had dropped more than forecast, suggesting another front would arrive by afternoon. I saddled my horse early and headed toward a trail junction where I planned to replace 2 damaged signs before the weather reached me. About 3 miles out, I found the missing trail map. It had been folded carefully and tucked beneath a flat rock directly beside a junction marker. At first, that seemed almost helpful until I unfolded it. Someone had circled 3 old fire roads outside the park boundary in blue pencil. None connected to visitor routes. One hadn't been drivable in years because of washouts. On the back of the map, someone had copied the call sign painted on my cabin radio cabinet. Visitors wouldn't normally know that identifier because it stayed inside the building. I slipped the map into a waterproof pouch and continued working, but I shortened the day's patrol. Clouds were already building over the ridge and radio coverage became unreliable once I entered the narrow drainage. By early afternoon, the trail crew still hadn't appeared. Instead, I found fresh tire impressions where there should have been none, crossing a grassy administrative path closed by a locked barrier several miles away. The tracks were narrow, likely from an older utility vehicle. The gate itself remained locked. Whoever entered had driven around it through young lodgepole saplings, leaving broken trunks no wider than broom handles. That changed the situation from odd to reportable. I tried raising dispatch, but static overwhelmed every transmission. The approaching storm was interfering with the relay again. I decided the quickest solution was to return directly to the cabin and use the roof-mounted antenna. Halfway back, I noticed ravens circling low near the meadow, not feeding, just hopping between fence posts beside the horse pasture. They flushed before I reached the clearing. My horse slowed on its own. One saddle blanket I had hung across the hitching rail that morning had been moved. Not stolen, folded. Neater than I ever folded it. Nothing else was disturbed. My storage shed remained locked, windows intact. Inside the cabin, however, the maintenance log I had completed the previous evening sat open on the table instead of inside the drawer where I always kept it. The only new mark was a faint thumbprint of blue pencil dust near the page margin. I closed every shutter, switched on the radio, and finally reached dispatch through bursts of interference. I reported the vehicle tracks, the marked map, and the cabin entry. They immediately informed me the trail crew had never departed headquarters because a rock slide had closed the access road that morning. Nobody authorized had been anywhere near my sector since I rode in. 2 law enforcement rangers started toward me, but estimated arrival after dark because horses were the only way through the black trail. My instructions were simple: remain at the station, unless life safety required movement. The afternoon storm arrived with steady rain instead of heavy wind. Water drummed softly against the metal roof, while I inventored equipment again. Everything remained accounted for, except one item I hadn't noticed missing before: a spare key to an old maintenance fuel cache about 6 miles away. That cache had been abandoned years earlier after new storage regulations took effect, but the lock had never been replaced because nothing valuable remained there. The realization bothered me because the key hung on a labeled board inside the office where visitors had no reason to look. As evening settled, Headlights briefly reflected through the trees west of the meadow, not direct beams, more like light bouncing off low clouds. They disappeared almost immediately. I logged the time. Nearly an hour later, the mounted law enforcement team arrived, soaked from the ride.
We followed the utility vehicle tracks at first light the next morning. They led beyond the damaged gate, across an overgrown fire road, and ended near the abandoned fuel cache. Inside the empty concrete structure, we found food wrappers, disposable gloves, recent boot prints, and several topo maps covering routes that bypassed visitor entrances and ranger patrol schedules. Whoever had been using the place left in a hurry before sunrise, taking everything that identified them. We never located the vehicle or the people connected to it. The investigation eventually concluded that unknown individuals had been scouting isolated service routes, likely preparing to move stolen equipment through protected land without attracting attention. It was considered solved well enough for administrative purposes. A month later, during a routine archive review, I requested the original trail map for evidence photographs. The blue circles were still there.
What caught my attention instead was a tiny pencil mark near my cabin, so faint I hadn't noticed it before. It wasn't a route or a symbol. It was a square drawn exactly where the ranger cabin stood, and beside it, someone had written 2 dates. The first matched the day I arrived. The second was 3 days earlier.